There are a few things I want you to know about photography. First of all, the magnitude of the impact it had. That is expressed perfectly in this fantastic cartoon from December 1839 depicting the state of France after the announcement of the daguerreotype, the new type of photography that had been released. This is a daguerreotype of the man, Louis-Jacques Daguerre, credited with this new incredible technology. The cartoon shows the mania that has erupted, in which it seems like all of France is lining up in these great crowds extending all the way back to the horizon to buy a camera, to photograph and be photographed. You see the camera store here has a camera at the top with a clock on it. You see the steam train in the distance has cameras, enormous cameras on wheels instead of freight cars. Cameras are being loaded on the steamship. Everyone is swept up into the craze, including the mother trying to get her child to sit still. And if you can't sit still, little kid, there's the guy over here with the contraptions that are invented for holding people in place for the time it takes to complete the photograph here in the beginning of the technology. We see all of the chemicals laid out that are used in the making of these early photographs. So, early photography, the first kinds of photography that emerge, unleashed a hunger for mass-produced, widely available images, commercially made images that were available to all sorts of people from different walks of life. And this was a huge change from a world where images had really been mostly the prerogative of the upper class. And so one of the interesting features in this cartoon is that you have here, amidst this daguerreotype, this mania for daguerreotypes, you have these people who have hung themselves in despair. They're the artists who, the wicked joke is, will no longer have a livelihood. So that didn't actually happen. Artists still made paintings, portraits, but there's no doubt that photography changed artistic culture, image culture, culture itself forever, radically. And this kind of mania for mechanically made images still lives on today. We just call it the internet. Instagram. We have thousands of photographs on our phones. So I want you to understand that photography was driven by a thirst for images and fueled a thirst for images. Photography as a technology was not invented by one person in one place at one point in time. It actually came about because many different pre-existing technologies of image making came together. People had known about the phenomenon called the camera obscura for centuries. It goes back to Aristotle in 322 BCE. It was written about in 1544 in the Renaissance. It was used by Vermeer in the 1600s. So people already knew that a darkened room with a pinhole open could allow light to enter and would project an upside-down image on the opposite wall. They already knew that you could change the focus and the image depth through the size of the pinhole. They just didn't have a way to permanently record that image that was left on the wall, except by hand. And artists did use this technique, this technology, in order to make drawing studies, such as Vermeer, in order to gain a degree of precision that allowed them to carefully assemble their compositions. The camera obscura was already known, but by the 1800s, by the late 1700s into the early 1800s, you start to get more and more people wanting portraits of themselves as the middle classes gain more wealth, more power, more cultural presence, they want representations of themselves. And they want them done as cheaply as they can have them and still enjoy them. They don't want to invest as much as the royals would invest in their 10-foot tall oil painting portraits. So here you start to get a culture of techniques like the silhouette, where you see this woman seated in the chair in this contraption where she holds on to the rods in order to stay still. The candlelight is reflecting so that her shadow is cast onto translucent paper, and her shadow, that's the silhouette, is traced in order to make a kind of very precise and personal portrait. This is a prefiguration of what photography will do with light and shadow and the capturing of a person's presence. Silhouettes were very popular, and we can see them as part of an image culture that's moving toward photography because it's serving to kind of fulfill that hunger for images that the middle classes are wanting to have in order to express their place in the world and their sense of themselves. So people know about the camera obscura, and around the early 1800s, people start experimenting with different ways to capture images automatically. That's the idea behind photography. Automate the image-making process. And so they're exploring photosensitive materials. People had long observed that materials are sensitive to the sun, that curtains bleach. Our own skin is a photosensitive material. But they didn't know exactly how it worked, so there was a lot of experimentation, as in the case of a man named Joseph Nicephore Niepce, who was working on reproducing artworks using photosensitive materials. He tried all sorts of things, bitumen of Judea. He was starting to work with silvers, silver nitrate and silver chloride. There were technical problems, but he persisted. Eventually, he was able to make a landscape photograph, this a view from outside his window, the landscape he sees, that succeeded in photographing his environment, but the exposure took 8 hours because the photosensitivity was still so slow that he had to have it exposed to the sun for 8 hours, so you see the angles, the sun hitting the building at different angles from different times of day. Niepce eventually partnered with Daguerre. And so really what we're seeing is this invention that gets called photography is a process of building one understanding on top of another, adding one element, refining an element. And Niepce and Daguerre work together on the chemistry of the photosensitive materials. Daguerre discovers how to develop images from exposures using mercury vapors, very toxic. That shortens the exposure time needed. And he figures out how to fix the images so they don't fade away. That's what was happening. People were finding they could make an image stay on a photosensitive material, but then it would fade as it was exposed to more light. So the question became, how do you then protect it from the light? These were all the little technical refinements, and eventually Daguerre develops a system that works and becomes the daguerreotype. This famous photograph is from right when he's making it right when he's about to announce the procedure, the technology, and offer it to France. And it is a photograph out the window. It is a photograph of the city street that would have at the time been thronged with crowds of bustling people. But because of the exposure time, it seems to be eerily empty. The only figures that stood still long enough to leave a solid impression in the light-sensitive material are the man getting his shoe shine and the shoe shine person. So still, this technique takes a great deal of time to complete an exposure of the image so that the image is, if you will, written into the chemicals. But this was a profound change because we now have a machine for making pictures, and it is announced to the public in 1839, setting off the Daguerreotypomania that we saw in the cartoon. The daguerreotype uses a metal plate. It uses mercury vapors in order to fix the image in the metal plate, and it offers an incredible degree of precision. This was what people at the time noted first and foremost. They were absolutely beguiled. They were beguiled with a photograph like this of Frederick Douglass, in which you seem to see every feature of the person, the sense of the person being actually present, as if you almost, some part of your brain forgets that this is a photograph and you feel as if you are looking at the person himself. This is part of the great power of photography. It's one of the reasons that photographs of historical giants like Frederick Douglass, the great figures of the past, are so important because they give us a sense of actually connecting to them. Since a photograph is a trace of a moment, it is literally the light that passed onto the plate when that person was present is recorded. Now, interestingly, this daguerreotype is a rather fragile image. It can be scratched. It has a little bit of a glassy surface, and so daguerreotypes like this one were kept in special cases to protect them, also to honor them. Daguerreotypes were also different than photographs as we know them, modern photographs, because they were a single, unique object. The word unique means one. There is only one. They were not reproducible. And this is significant because we do not make daguerreotypes of each other anymore. This technology dies out, and the kind of photography that will lead to modern photography comes from a different branch of photographic experimentation. So if you see in this powerful photograph of Frederick Douglass later in his life, 1876, you can tell it's later in his life because his hair has gone white, although he still has that same intensely brilliant gaze. This is an albumin print. This is made with a different set of chemicals, and it's made on paper. It's printed on paper. And the magical key ingredient, it is made in a method that is reproducible. You can make multiples of this. That is essential to the full potential of photography as we know it, which is not just about a mechanically made image, but about mechanically reproducible images. So it's important to know that photography developed along multiple phases, along multiple branches, and modern photography was based on an alternate system from the daguerreotype, a system devised by an Englishman named William Henry Fox Talbot, who devised a system in which the image is printed on paper, and he was able, in fact, to reproduce his images in a book. He called it The Art of Photogenic Drawing. He was inspired by the desire to be able to draw nature. He felt as if he didn't have the kind of drawing skills that he wished he had, and he pursued photography as a way to, as he called it, cultivate nature's pencil. His system, which he called the calotype, created a very different effect from the hard, precise, metallic surfaces of the daguerreotype. With its paper surface and its different chemicals, there's a softness to it. And Talbot was interested in the artistic side of photography, which was going to be hotly debated well into the 20th century.